Hopefully there's fewer of them than that. Okay, two things. The first is it isn't obvious what the population would be that you would compare this population to, right? Because you could say, well, the boundary is the 400 people in this room, but it isn't necessarily the case. The 400 people in this room might be the square root of the broader population who are interested in this sort of thing. But with the Pareto distribution, what you also see is that it's self-similar. And so, let's say there's 400 people doing something, 20 of them are doing half the work. But if you take those 20, 4 of them are doing half the work of the 20, and 1 of the 4 is doing half the work of the 4. And so, so why am I telling you that? Well, first of all, it isn't that there isn't useful work to be done at multiple slices of the Pareto distribution, but the other thing is, it's also the case that there's not only one Pareto distribution. Right, because you might say, well, if it's just the square root of the number of people in a domain that are doing half the work, then, what do you do with the rest of the people? And the answer to that might be, well, they're in a different Pareto distribution as well, where they're doing something productive. So.
Is this just a consequence of, you had identified it, how successful or effective the competence hierarchy is?
Well, I think it's a good question. Like, we don't exactly so the basic rule is, the basic rule is, for example, if you take 100 scientists in a given domain, 10 of them will have published half the papers. And this works with everything. It works with every creative domain. The rule applies. So now the question is why, and I think the answer to that seems to be, and I've watched people who've become spectacularly successful, and what happens is that 0 is a really bad place to be. Right? It's really hard to get out of 0. And that's often why people are trapped in poverty. Because if you have nothing, getting to something is virtually impossible. Once you have something, getting to a little more of something is actually quite a bit easier. And so, what seems to happen, this is also called the Matthew principle, right? It's the same principle, so that's a New Testament citation, let's say. The Matthew principle is, to those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. That's another one of those lines in the New Testament that you'd think that a good editor would have just got rid of. So, but I think what it is that every time you make a step forward, the probability that you'll be able to take the next step forward increases. And it seems to increase in a nonlinear way. So the world that the Matthew principle describes is nonlinear. So you might say, well, what's your trajectory if you're moving upward? Well, it's not this. It's this. What's your trajectory if you're moving downward? It's not this. It's this, right? You fall, you plummet. You rise, you transcend. It's something like that. And you might say, well, that's a hell of a world, but whatever. It has to be run by some principle, and that's the principle that it appears to be run by. Yes.
Does that mean that, just do whatever works without regards for any other?
No, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that every truth claim you make, including those that are implicit in your actions, carries with it an ethic that justifies or doesn't justify the action. So for example, let's say I have a tool and I say it's an axe, and I go out in the forest and I try to cut down a tree with it, and it doesn't work. It's not an axe. It's something else. And so there's a good book on pragmatism called The Metaphysical Club, A History of American Ideas. It's one I would really recommend. And what the pragmatists, I can't give you a full answer because this is such a complicated issue, but what the pragmatists were wrestling with back in the late 1800s, this was William James and his crew in Boston. Including a philosopher named C.S. Peirce, who was perhaps America's greatest philosopher. They were wrestling with the same issue that the postmodernists would wrestle with 100 years later, which is things are indefinitely complex and we're not very bright. So how is it that we can make claims to truth about anything? And what their hypothesis essentially is that with every action and with every truth claim, you simultaneously demarcate a territory within which that claim is valid. And you you determine whether the claim is valid by noting whether your prediction about the outcome of your action or your belief is commensurate, is in keeping with. If the outcome is in keeping with the prediction, then what you've said or done is true or good enough. And that's as good as you get. And so that's the pragmatic perspective. And then when the pragmatists encountered Charles Darwin's works, they immediately recognized that Darwin had generated a pragmatic solution to the problem of the impossibility of being. The impossibility of being is this: there's way more cosmos than there is you. You are going to die. You cannot generate a sufficient solution to the problem of your being. No one can. Nothing can. It's like the environment is a snake that moves unpredictably across time and you're trying to stay on its back. Well, how does the Darwinian process deal with that? It produces infinite variance, roughly speaking, almost all of which die. And that's how it solves the problem across time. And the things that exist, the things that stay alive, are true enough. And that's the best you get. That's the argument I was trying to have with Sam Harris. Because Harris doesn't take his evolutionary theory seriously enough. But we kept getting bogged down. Anyways, that's the best answer. Well, I'd like to agree with that, but it's not true.
And you find that it works if you be somewhat deceitful in
Yeah.
your You know, like cunning or
Yeah.
Like subtle.
Yeah.
And it's not forthright and it's not steadfast and it's not based on some sort of truth that you know.
Yeah.
Would that mean it's true in the sense that a pragmatist says it's true? Or you're only talking about like scientific truths about the...
You really do like to ask hard questions, don't you? I think it depends. See, this is also why I like the Piagetian take, let's say, on pragmatism, because I think that pragmatism as a philosophy has the limitation that you just described, but only if you think about the games as limited. If you have to play the game in an iterative way, then that issue resolves itself. And the game theorists have done a good job of mapping that out. It's like, you could say, let's say, pragmatically speaking, there's no reason I shouldn't deceive you once if I can get what I want. It's yeah, except that I'm probably not only going to interact with you once, I'm going to interact with you a lot. And even if it isn't you that I interact with, it's going to be a bunch of beings that are so much like you that it might as well be you. It's going to be me, if nothing else. And so the pragmatic game stretched across time would include the necessity of iterability in relationship to the validations of the truth claims. That's how it looks to me.